Good morning. I'd like to welcome everyone to the PFAS 101, a primer on PFAS for public health professionals webinar on May 5th, 2023. My name is Don Moore, and I'm a public health preparedness training coordinator with the Virginia Department of Health Office of Emergency Preparedness. I'll briefly cover a few administrative announcements before we begin. Microphones and telephones are muted. Following each presentation, 10 minutes will be allowed for question and answers. Feel free to ask questions in the chat during the presentation as well. Unanswered questions will be answered and the answers posted to the PFAS 101 training website. Participants who join by telephone who have questions should email their questions to eprtraining@vdh.virginia.gov. If you registered and trained, you'll be verified following the training. Your feedback is requested. Please complete the SurveyMonkey survey provided in the chat. The URL is. The URL will also be emailed to all participants. Also, feel free to refer to the PFAS 101 training website for future updates. I'll provide that in chat as well. This webinar is being recorded. Now I'll introduce the presenters for the training. Brookie Crawford is the Central Region Public Information Officer with the Virginia Department of Health. She has been with VDH for 3 years. Prior to that, she worked 17 years as a policy specialist with the Virginia Department of Emergency Management. Anthony Creech serves as the Environmental Technical Programs Manager for the Division of On-Site Water and Wastewater in the Office of Environmental Health Services. He oversees training and other programs related to on-site sewage systems and private wells. Anthony has worked with the Virginia Department of Health for over 6 years, prior to which he worked 27 years in private sector environmental consulting associated with groundwater, all in Virginia. Dr. Dwight Flamia serves as the state public health toxicologist. His office conducts risk assessments, issues fish consumption advisories, and advises state, local, and federal agencies on matters pertaining to hazards in the environment that may impact health. Julie Henderson serves as the Office Director of Environmental Health Services. She oversees multiple environmental health programs that are largely administered by local health district staff. Julie has worked for the Virginia Department of Health for over 30 years in multiple capacities within environmental health. She started her public health career at the Norfolk Health Department and most appreciates her time in the Shellfish program where she captained boats. Dr. Tony Singh serves as the Deputy Director at the Virginia Department of Health, Office of Drinking Water, and is responsible for the regional field operations, 6 regional field offices, and Division of Technical Services. The Office of Drinking Water implements the Safe Drinking Water Act across Virginia public drinking water supplies via 2,800 or more waterworks. Jeff Steers serves as the Director of Regional Operations at the Department of Environmental Quality, overseeing 6 regional offices responsible for permitting, compliance, monitoring, enforcement, and spill response. This training is dedicated in memory of Lori Andrew Spear. In 2013, she joined the Virginia Department of Health as its Northern Virginia Regional Public Information Officer and later became the statewide Risk Communications Manager. She obtained certification as a Master Public Information Officer from FEMA's Emergency Management Institute, where she earned the respect and admiration of her peers nationwide. She frequently served in leadership positions with national public health and information organizations and established herself as a valuable contributor and role model. Here's the agenda for today's training. Now we'll get started with the presentations. The first presentation's overarching learning objective is Introduction to PFAS to include naming conventions, physical and chemical properties, production, uses, sources, and human impacts and risk assessments. Please put questions and comments in chat, and I'll turn it over to Dr. Flynn.
Good morning and welcome, everyone. I'm Dwight Flammy, a public health toxicologist, and we're very happy to have you here with us this morning. So let's get started talking about per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, commonly known as PFAS. So in 1938, Roy Plunkett, a scientist at DuPont, was working with gases commonly used in the refrigeration industry. And in doing so, they accidentally polymerized and formed this incredible substance that would later be identified as polytetrafluoroethylene, which we know today as Teflon. This, in 1940s and 50s, perfluorooctane sulfonic acid and perfluorooctanoic acid were being used as precursors to make PTFE or Teflon products. As you can see on the top right of your screen is PFOA. It has 8 carbon atoms, where the 7 to the right of it are fully fluorinated. This is called the tail region of the molecule. The leftmost carbon atom is actually the head region and is part of a carboxylic acid, or an organic chemistry. That's the name of that functional group. Because these compounds are resistant to chemical and thermal degradation, they started to be used in a number of things in the 1950s and 60s, which included the manufacturing of stain-resistant carpets, water-resistant products, and also in food packaging and nonstick cookware. In the 1960s and 70s, the U.S. Navy worked with 3M, a chemical company, to develop firefighting foam that contained PFAS substances. Shortly after their arrival, many toxicologists working in both industry and in the defense were concerned about worker exposures. They knew that laboratory animals that were being tested with these compounds were having adverse health effects, and also they documented workers that were actually having adverse health effects. For instance, several children were born with birth defects to women that actually worked in the PFAS industry. In the 1980s, a cattle farming family sold part of their land to DuPont in Parkersburg, West Virginia, which is their Washington Works plant, where they made Teflon. DuPont used this land as a landfill that was unlined. They dumped a lot of their chemicals there, and in 1999, the cattle farmer sued DuPont, alleging that the chemicals that were being dumped were responsible for his family's illnesses, the illness and death of many cattle that he kept. This was later followed by a class action lawsuit of 70,000 people. It had to do with the same waterworks in the Ohio River Valley at the Parkersburg Teflon industry. As part of the settlement of this case, well, the reason for it was that the DuPont facility in Parkersburg, West Virginia, was actually polluting the Ohio River and also groundwater, which was the source water for 6 waterworks, which of course exposed many people to it. As part of the settlement, DuPont was forced to conduct an epidemiological study known commonly as the CH study. And what this study showed was that PFOA was linked to probably linked to several diseases, including ulcerative colitis, thyroid disease, increased hypertension during pregnancy, kidney and testicular cancer, and high cholesterol. Also in 2000, 3M, one of the primary manufacturers of these compounds, began phasing out their use, and in 2006, EPA initiated a stewardship with 8 major users and producers of these compounds to phase out or eliminate their use of several PFAS compounds. So collectively, if we look at more than just the PFOA compounds, their impact on health can be summarized as that they may decrease vaccine response in children, cause an increase in cholesterol, cause changes in enzyme levels, increased risk of high blood pressure or preeclampsia in pregnant women, increased risk of kidney and or testicular cancer, and also cause small decreases in infant birth weight. Because of the widespread use of PFAS and PFOA, they can be found in more than 90% of the general population. The one bright or shiny side to it is that since 1999, the levels of PFAS and PFOA in the general population has decreased by 50%. So if we look at naming conventions, to some extent, PFAS can be grouped as to non-polymers and polymers. The polymers are larger compounds made up of smaller repeating units, and they're not considered at this point to have any impact on health. The non-polymers are made up of the perfluorinated and the polyfluorinated. The perfluorinated ones that have the most work done and are widely found in the environment are PFAS, POFOS, and PFOA. The polyfluorinated compound that you see on the bottom right of your screen is a fluorotelmer. In green, you can see those carbon atoms are fluorinated. The other two carbon atoms to the far right in the box actually are protected by fluorine atoms. And this actually makes a weak link in the molecule. And when in the environment, this compound where those carbon atoms are can degrade to a carboxylic acid, which then produces a perfluorinated compound, which we know is stable in the environment. So some general properties, the carbon fluorine tail shown in green is one of the strongest single covalent bonds in organic chemistry. The electron negativity property of the fluorine atom shields the carbon atom. The fluorine tail is hydrophobic and lipophobic in that it repels both water and oily substances. The two compounds shown, PFOS and PFOA, have the functional heads are going to be negatively charged in the environment. The heads are polar, hydrophilic in that they don't repel water, and because they are going to be charged, they also play a role in how their fate and transport, and this makes them very mobile in groundwater. These compounds are going to have low volatility. As I mentioned before, perfluorinated acids may be formed by the degradation of the polyfluoroalkyl substance or other polyfluoroalkyl substances. They're resistant to environmental degradation. And at the bottom right is hexafluoropropylene oxide. This compound was made to replace PFOA. The interesting thing with this one is that it's not linear, it's branched, and although it still may have adverse health effects, these compounds don't tend to bioaccumulate to any appreciable extent in animals. So we're going to talk briefly about risk assessments, and this is because if you look through the literature, have been following the literature of what government agencies have been doing, you'll see that they have difference in what they call their reference doses or what's considered acceptable daily doses for humans to be exposed to. So if we look at an ideal situation where universities and researchers across the country are studying animals and increasing doses of a particular compound or PFAS, one university may be looking at what the response is, such as measuring immune effects on the immune system, or another may be looking at increasing dose and measuring the response on reproduction or birth weights. And then what government agencies will do is they'll take these studies and determine, first of all, they have to select which study they find to be the most important and most robust and determine if there's a no effect level, which is an ideal situation. So this would be the highest dose where you don't see an effect. And then we know that humans are different than animals in the way that we metabolize, process chemicals. And so what they'll do is they'll reduce this no effect level by like a 10-fold or a 3-fold. Or they may look at the study and say, well, this study that we like is less than chronic, it's a subchronic study. So to account for this, they'll apply another 10-fold reduction, and then until they finally get the reference dose. So a lot of this is based on each agency's practice or guidance, and also on professional judgment. So if we look at PFOA, the daily doses have changed or are different depending on when they were proposed, and also different between agencies. So the Environmental Protection Agency in July of 2022 came with a reference dose that was 1.5 times 10 to the minus 9. This was based on the suppression of the tetanus vaccine in 7-year-old children. It came from an epidemiological study published in 2012 and a follow-up one in 2018. Likewise, the EPA in 2016 had a RFD for P4 that was 2.0 times 10 to the minus 5, which is 1,010-fold times higher. This was based on a rodent study. So even with this, you can look and see that in 2022 and 2016, EPA would have had access to the 2012 and the 2006 paper, but they chose different ones. And again, it could be based on new information, new guidance that they're using, or even the toxicologists and changes in professional judgment at the time. Likewise, to the right of your screen, ATSDR, the Agency for Toxic Substance and Disease Registry, in May of 2021, did use the 2012 paper, which resulted in that very low reference dose, but instead they used skeletal alteration in mice study done in 2016. So this just kind of highlights that different agencies have different reasons and rationale for how they come up with their reference daily dose. But you have to keep in mind, most of them are starting from an effect that is not even present in the animal. So for the most part, they are protective. But yes, one could argue that 1.5 times 10 to the minus 9 is more protective than the other ones. So PFAS, where can be found in our community? The largest source is going to be what we ingest, particularly where PFAS is in the has been released into the environment and pollutes source drinking water. Consumer products, stain-resistant carpet and furniture can be a source of producing dust that in the homes may have PFAS. Airports, where firefighting foam is used, can get into the environment, particularly in waterway. Same thing, individuals can be exposed to PFAS where they work. Also, depending on how manufacturers and industry dispose of it, could be a source of PFAS in the environment. Fish that are caught and consumed from waterways that are contaminated with PFAS is another source of PFAS in the environment. And biosolids, it depends on the source of the biosolids, and it being land applied could be a source of PFAS in the environment. And that's all that I have. Do you have any? Does anyone have any questions? If so, make sure that you take off mute.
No, put them in chat.
Oh, I'm sorry. If you have any questions, put it in the chat.
Seeing the gains, right? So,
If you think of anything, you can always put it in the chat, and like Donald said, we can address it later. Now we.
good. Yeah, good. So next, we'll discuss PFAS in the environment, including site characterization, fate and transport, sampling and analysis, treatment and technology, and a PFAS case study. Please put your questions and comments in chat. I'll turn it over to Jeff Steers, Dr. Singh, and Anthony Preach.
Thank you and good morning. First, I'd like to start out and talk a little bit about how PFAS compounds get into our environment, how they're distributed, and the exposure routes that we see. I will start off by saying, just to follow up with what Dr. Flamia said, these compounds have very strong carbon-fluorine bonds and make them very difficult to break. And at the same time, the properties that make these compounds so useful in society are also the properties that make them very difficult to manage in our environment. So we have several sources that we see, and a lot of sources could be either historic because they persist for so long, or they could be newly generated sources. So we have, on the far left, we have a lot of potential industrial sources based on the type of manufacturing that use these compounds historically. And you heard about Teflon and other materials, the non-stick materials and things for carpet, furniture, that are stain resistant, water repellent for certain types of clothing. There's also the use of it in firefighting foams, especially to fight oil and fuel fires. And so there has been historic use of these materials for a long time. As Virginia's economy has switched over, a lot of, for example, furniture manufacturing may have no longer be as popular in the state as it used to be. However, there's residuals of these chemicals that will continue to persist. And I equate it somewhat to PCBs in the environment, where they're not, those compounds are not being currently used, but they're persistent, and we see them in all types of media. Traditionally, when you think of an industrial source, it's discharging a wastewater from some process like plating, which uses it as a detergent to keep down vaporization of water in the process. In doing that, there's these compounds traditionally aren't being treated as they go down the sewer out a direct discharge into Virginia's waterways. Also, there are potential air sources where these compounds are being heated and during a manufacturing process, and they escape into the atmosphere. So to focus a little bit on the wastewater side, most traditional activated sludge processes are not designed to treat these compounds in whatever concentrations that they may be in, whether it's low, whether it's high. So typically they're going to pass through the process and either end up in their effluent or in their biosolid sludge that has to be disposed of. And there's still a lot of study being done as to how they react in the process. But again, similar to the industrial sources, when a municipal wastewater treatment plant receives these compounds, you're going to get, just like you would with any organic compounds, you're going to get some level of volatilization into the environment and a splitting of these compounds into the solid and liquid phases. So if we think of the effluent then that comes out of a wastewater treatment plant and goes into a surface water under a permit that DEQ issues, there's dilution, but still these compounds are persistent. And since we're talking, and we'll hear later from Dr. Singh, the levels that we're talking about to be regulated under the Drinking Water Act, we're talking parts per trillion and single parts per trillion in a lot of cases. So it doesn't take much to get into the environment and surface water to create a problem for the water sources that are downstream. When we look at sludge application, where it's land applied, it's the same thing where it can get into the agricultural soil. There are studies still being done on how much crop uptake you get with PFAS compounds. But there's also the concerns that in high enough concentrations, it actually will leach down into the groundwater. And that becomes a whole nother issue. So you could have groundwater, and you can also have runoff surface water that have PFAS in it. If sludge is disposed of in a landfill, then it potentially is getting into the leachate, just as waste disposal from sources in the industrial setting are disposed of in a landfill. And then when you take that as well as consumer products that are used in the home and disposed of in a landfill, those products have PFAS in them. That ends up in the leachate that gets to the bottom of a landfill. Thankfully, we have leachate collection systems in our modern landfills, and so that leachate's collected and disposed of appropriately in a wastewater treatment plant. But if you think about it, that PFAS then is going to the wastewater treatment plant and just starting the whole process over. So with PFAS compounds, it really is all about, it ends up transferring from one environmental media to another unless it's destroyed. So we also have concern with, if we have old landfills that were never, did not have leachate collection or liner systems that currently are in corrective action for other chlorinated solvents and metals. Those landfills potentially have PFAS compounds in them that are getting into the groundwater and potentially in the surface water when there's a direct correlation or connection, hydraulic connection to surface water. So all these things getting into the air, and then you can get volatilization, you can get actual runoff, you can get rain with contaminated from PFAS, and all of that gets dispersed into surface water and potentially into sediment, where we currently are doing some studies on sediment and surface water and fish tissue. So it has a direct result on the aquatic ecosystems, uptake in plants and in public water supplies, and land-based ecosystem plants and animals and livestock, for example. So, and just to give you a kind of combination of how these things react, this just gives you a depiction which looks at what I talked about before, which is old industrial waste that's been buried inappropriately that may have PFAS that can get into the groundwater and potentially into surface water. You have also sediments in old lagoons and surface impoundments that may have PFAS accumulating and getting in, if they're an unlined surface impoundment, which we have around the state. Those are also potential sources, and they all can end up in a surface water body in sediment and the water account. Same with landfills. I mentioned the unlined landfills and biosolids land application. Again, there are no standards currently, and we'll get into regulatory issues later, but there are no current standards for what is a acceptable level or a regulatory level for PFAS compounds in biosolids land application. Some states have developed their own standards, and some are just requiring monitoring. At this time, Virginia does not require any monitoring for any effluent or land application of biosolids. And then firefighting foams, as I mentioned, which is used typically in training as well as in fighting actual fires. I'll talk later about Virginia and a new statute that mandates that PFAS not to be used, compounds in firefighting foam not to be used in training exercises, that a substitute needs to be found. And so it's really in the state should only be used as active firefighting. However, there are a lot of sites where training has been done, especially military facilities, where a significant amount has been dispersed into the groundwater. And again, the takeaway from this slide is basically when you look at these diffusions in and out of low permeability soils, you may remove a source of PFAS, but it may persist in the groundwater even after that because of the way these materials react. So you could be doing a long-term groundwater remediation project in the future, even though maybe the source of a site that was being cleaned up has been removed. And again, air transport, I just wanted to highlight that waste to energy burning of municipal solid waste is a potential source. The temperatures to burn these compounds and break these bonds is probably not high enough at some of our municipal solid waste incinerators. EPA is doing a lot of research right now on this issue, so we in Virginia, like a lot of states, are waiting to hear what they have to say on that topic and provide guidance to states. Industrial processes, I already talked about stack emissions. and incineration of or products of combustion containing PFAS compounds. What we're going to learn about later is there's technology to manage these compounds and treat them in water and waste. However, in doing so, we need to be careful that we're not just transferring it from the solid phase into the liquid phase, and that we've got a process in place to adequately destroy these compounds, which is usually in high temperature combustion. And I believe I wanted to quickly go through what we're doing in Virginia at DEQ to monitor for this in surface water. This is kind of a new program we just started the last year or so, when the General Assembly finally gave us some money to look at doing some sampling, limited sampling. And so we've been looking at doing and have started to conduct ambient monitoring across the state. We've got some special study areas, which I'll just talk about later, but at this point, we've got trend stations, we've got some of our Chesapeake Bay stations and other potential, what I'll call hotspots or areas of concern that we've identified. And this just gives you from the previous year, it looks at this will describe some of the locations and what types of locations those were. And you can see again that the targeted areas of concern are based on data that we have from other studies that are being done. And again, we're continuing this. We're also looking at deep groundwater monitoring wells that we have in the coastal plain aquifer to see if there's been any influence of PFAS in those areas, and some of our trend monitoring stations. And the state lab, which we'll get into later with Dr. Singh, is going to be available to start using some of sampling doing analytical work on our samples beginning hopefully this month. And we're using a draft modified method 1633, which I won't get into now because that is Dr. Singh's expertise. This gives you an idea of how much monitoring we plan to do, and you can see it's quite extensive. And the nice thing about this is when we get data, we want to be transparent with the public in what we see in that data. So we've developed a tracking tool, an online tool, an interactive map that you can go through and look at all of our surface and groundwater monitoring, our fish tissue testing, our sediment monitoring. You can filter the data by station type, look by media type, and in the future, we would like to include some of our point source effluent monitoring whenever we start doing requiring that. Also looking at source water surveillance monitoring that BDH is involved with, and biosolids and land application sites. So at this time, it's pretty, it's being developed as we go along. So it's a works in progress. And I'm just giving you screenshots of what it is. But I did want to, and here you can just track some of the highest to lowest PFAS and look at the range of PFAS samplings. And you can see we have a maximum concentration at one location of 1.1 thousand parts per trillion. So we've got some significant hits in some of the areas, which I'll talk about later. And just, you can write this down, but this is the link to the tracking tool. We also have it on our webpage. You can find it pretty easy, especially if you just search PFAS tracking tool. But this is our interactive link, and I will stop there and take any questions anyone may have in the chat box.
Oh, so, trend.
Okay. There's some questions. What can VDH as an agency do to reduce the use of PFAS? I'll take a little bit of that from to start with. What can VDH as an agency, maybe this, let's say, state government do to reduce the use of PFAS chemicals and products? And we can provide guidance, but what it really is, it's the General Assembly doing things. And I think we're going to hear about this later where certain consumer products, there may be a ban. I know other states have different, if you go across the country, there's different laws enacted to reduce the use of it, whether it's in firefighting foams or certain products, especially food containers. So there is a effort underway, and that's one way. But some of it, I think the General Assembly really has to take the leadership in being able to come up with some ways to ban the use of certain compounds. We can provide guidance on how to treat it and manage it when it's in the environment or before it gets in the environment, if it's in an industrial process and it can be treated. And I think one of the things for helping our local community members to abate such chemicals or products with them, first, it's education. It's all about educating the public on the issues associated with these compounds and the troubles that we have once they get into the environment, and work with organizations to educate the public on what things they may come in contact with that can be a high risk to their health. If collected, captured, how can these be retooled to produce lower toxicity chemicals and products? Again, one of the biggest thing, I don't know if it's, you say if collected or captured, but if you're trying to treat these in a wastewater, you end up having to provide some type of treatment, perhaps with granulated activated carbon that then has to be regenerated and probably has to be heated at very high temperatures to break that toxicity, those bonds into less toxic chemicals. Plant food sources for animals and source, that's where we get into air deposition as well as land application. And EPA is still doing research on this. And so in Virginia, we're not getting out ahead of what EPA is doing. However, we want to follow that. We want to follow their research and work with organizations in the agricultural community and others, for example, the Biosolids Council, on how we manage these going forward. So, okay, and we'll do the rest of these questions a little later. Transition back to the PowerPoint. Okay, let me get the PowerPoint back up. Sorry about that. It's okay. And at this point, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Dr. Singh.
Hey, good morning, everyone. This is Tony Singh from Virginia Department of Health, Office of Drinking Water. I would greatly appreciate if everyone can mute their mics, please. By now, you have heard from Dr. Flamia, Jeff Steers, that these compounds are everywhere. These substances are everywhere because of our lifestyle. And now for some of those chemicals, we know that they are toxic. They are potentially harmful to human health and animal health and environment. So the next logical question comes, what are we doing? Can we sample those? Can we measure those? And what tools are available? Can we treat those? And what Virginia is doing in that regard in terms of drinking water, whether it's public drinking water or private wells, as well as DEQ. Jeff Steers did share some of the things that DEQ has been doing. So in the later presentation, you will be hearing from our team on the activities that we are conducting to mitigate or to understand this issue in Virginia. So on the sampling and analysis part, this becomes really key in understanding the occurrence part of these chemicals. As Dwight mentioned, these compounds have been in use since the 1940s, so they are not new, but they're still called emerging contaminants because we still don't have accurate methods to analyze, to measure, to monitor all of these chemicals. We are talking about a family of more than 8,000 chemicals here. So it's hard not only to measure it, it's even harder to sample these chemicals properly because they are in our lifestyle. And the cross-contamination is very easy. We can, when a sampler collects a sample, and if he or she is not being very careful, then those samples can be cross-contaminated and false positive results can occur. There are methods, analytical methods available, private labs and private institutions and public institutions, research organizations. They have come up with their own analytical methods, but being the regulatory agency, we rely on EPA approved methods. And then I also want our audience to understand that there are separate analytical methods for PFAS in drinking water or source water or biosolids or air. So essentially, we cannot use a method from drinking water for source water, such as rivers or lakes, because of the metrics, because of the background composition of those samples. Recently, there have been some federal actions on this PFAS in the world of water, and I should say PFAS in the environment. So there is a huge push for more monitoring nationwide, and that has put extra pressure on our lab capacity. And so that's a concern. Because of that, it will be great for our audience to know that the turnaround time for this analysis is pretty high. And since many of our audience folks, they are from our local health districts, so there are methods available to do PFAS analysis in blood, serum, and all that, but they are not approved by EPA, CDC, and NIH, and ATSDR. They are working on those methods. There is funding available to monitor for these chemicals in public water supplies, and that is specifically for public water supplies at this time. And again, we have some tools available on our VDH ODW PFAS webpage related to sampling and analysis part. And, I wanted to mention that since these chemicals are everywhere, we wear them, and these are in our homes, in our carpets, in our cosmetics, in our waterproof gears, in our daily day-to-day items. So when you do go for sampling for such chemicals, you need to be very careful about the items that you use. You usually avoid any waterproof items, whether it's your waterproof gears or umbrella or shoes or any such thing. So that's the same that I have mentioned on this slide, that avoid any such gears and avoid low density polyethylene. Sometimes we just see that these are plastic bottles and we don't pay attention to whether it's low density polyethylene or high density polyethylene. So low density polyethylene LDPE bottles, they are not suitable for this analysis. Most of our conventional bottles, they come with caps that are lined with the Teflon so that they don't leak. But Teflon, as Dr. Fleming mentioned, is one potential source for these chemicals. So we should avoid such things. And again, I have mentioned some other things that what should we avoid, what should we use. For example, Sharpies, we usually use that in our sampling events, but in this case, they can also add to the contamination of the sample. So we usually avoid such things. Aluminum foils and such things are avoided. We always recommend not to do this sampling during rain, simply because there are chances that you may use some Sharpies or water-resistant Sharpies and gears that can contaminate the sample.
We're done.
On the PFAS analysis side, there are various tools that are available in the market right now. On the leftmost side, chromatography is the most accurate method or most accurate analytical instrumentation that can detect parts per trillion, nanograms per liter, or even parts per quadrillion.
But it isn't
short.
then if I decide.
So in the middle, there is a semi-quantitative tools that measure the total PFAS load, but again,
Mute on entry is not on. It is not checked. Can we do a sound check? Can everyone hear us now again?
I hear you, Donald.
Yep, here you.
Okay, bear with me one moment and I'll get back. Thanks, Rich.
Can you see our slides?
No.
Oh, okay. Awesome. And
Somebody says sound is faint.
Yeah, we're gonna, oh, let me close that. Dr. Singh. We're, hopefully you can hear us now and we should be good. Yeah, this is good. Okay.
all right. So we can start, and I think no technical or virtual webinar is complete unless we have some technical difficulty. So we apologize for that. So we're talking about sampling analysis and analytical work. And again, I wanted audience to be aware of these two type of terms that they would often hear. These are targeted analysis or non-targeted analysis. So essentially, when you collect a sample, if you ask a lab, then most of the time the lab would say that they are doing targeted analysis. And non-targeted analysis is more common for research, development, and educational purposes at this time. Essentially, the targeted analysis part comes into picture when you know what you're looking for in your sample and you already have a standard for that substance available in the lab. So essentially, lab takes that known substance in a known concentration, dissolve it in water, and train their machines to run these samples. That's after that they run the unknown samples, the field samples, and they get the concentration. Whereas in non-targeted analysis, this is available on high-res mass spectrophotometer, very high-end analytical instrumentation, where you can run an analysis and you can also look for substances that you don't have standards for. And one other contrast is that in non-targeted analysis, if you run a sample today, you get an analysis report today. And after a month, you want to go back and look at for some other analytes that you were not thinking previously, you can always go back and do that. The non-targeted analysis approach is very expensive, as you could imagine, because of the capabilities and the information that it provides. Okay. And here is a slide showing EPA-approved analytical methods. As I mentioned earlier, we have different medias, and these PFAS are everywhere. They are in our drinking water, source water, air. They could probably be in our landfills and other environmental medias. And EPA has done a great job in last few years approving these methods. On the drinking water side, method 537.1 and 533, they are used, whereas there are other method numbers approved by EPA for surface water, air, and landfills. EPA is still working on multiple other methods when it comes to biosolids, air, total PFAS load. And on this slide, I have also provided a hyperlink if you want to go directly to the EPA webpage that provide most of this analytical method information. Here is a slide that is on big nines. Essentially, there are more than 8,000 of these chemicals that are in production, not at this time, but that are in our environment. But these nines are most commonly found in our drinking water, and I have outlined in column second, third, and fourth their potential sources. They come from landfills, they come from our wastewater treatment plants, they come from our firefighting foams. So those are some of the key considerations when we plan or when we design any such sampling studies, that we look for such sources or the systems or the groundwater sources that are near to these facilities. I also wanted our audience to have this slide, that if they have any questions or concerns or need information on public water supplies, they can reach out to Drinking Water, Office of Drinking Water. And again, private wells, they are also handled here at Virginia Department of Health by our Office of Environmental Health Services. Whereas source water, landfills, air, storm water, rivers, any such questions dealing with that, those medias, they are directed to Virginia Department of Environmental Quality. We do work with DEQ on a regular basis on PFAS in Virginia's environment. And when we know that these are here, they are toxic, they have potential human health impacts, and we can analyze them, then the next question comes, that can we treat them? The physicochemical characteristics of these chemicals, such as they are resistant to high temperatures, they are water resistant, they are temperature resistant, and they have a very strong carbon fluorine bond. That is one of the strongest bond in the chemistry. So because of these unique physicochemical characteristics, these are hard to remove by most of the water treatment technologies. And again, we're talking about treating these chemicals to parts per trillion, nanogram per liter level, and that is also low PPT levels. So that makes it more challenging for treatment technologies. However, these contaminants, PFAS, they have been detected in groundwater, they have been detected in source water, and in many cases, you cannot, if there is a plume in a groundwater, you cannot take all the groundwater out and treat and put it back. So in such situations, we use in situ treatment technologies so that the water is there and we provide treatment in place. Whereas ex situ is more like pump and treat, that pump the water out, treat it, and then serve it or put it back into the aquifers. When it comes to drinking water treatment, not in Virginia, but nationwide, these are three major treatment technologies that are available, that are mentioned as best available treatment technologies for these chemicals. Granulated activated carbon, anion exchange, and to some extent high pressure membranes. High pressure membranes have some limitations, and because of those limitations, such as high operation and maintenance and capital investment, and they generate highly concentrated brines, so they are less favored in most of the locations. But granulated activated carbon is on the top spot. And there are some valid reasons for that, especially for drinking water treatment. I'm not talking about other environmental medias at this time. GAC, as we call granulated activated carbon, it's already being used at many of our drinking water treatment facilities. So they are familiar with the operation of GAC, and that makes it a little more favorable. Our drinking water treatment technologies, they remove organic matter to a very low level, and that is very suitable for GAC when it comes to PFAS removal. And again, they don't generate any brine. However, once this granulated activated carbon is exhausted, essentially all the PFAS is captured in those granulated activated carbons. So disposal of such GAC or ion exchange resins becomes a challenge. So essentially, here are a couple of pictures. If you go on a high wind, if you see these big drums next to a water treatment facility, the chances are that either they are storage tanks or they are granulated activated carbon tanks. And if we talk about Virginia PFAS activities, that are spread across VDH, Virginia Department of Environmental Quality. So these are three key areas there where most of our efforts are focused at this time. There are legislative bills, actions, as Jeff mentioned, there are multiple bills now, laws on this topic. And PFAS occurrence studies, we are learning more on these chemicals in Virginia, whether it's PFAS in drinking water or private wells or in wastewaters or source water. So that is one of our priority in understanding the occurrence of these chemicals in our Virginia environment. And PFAS collaborations, they are important to us. We like to keep our collaborators, our stakeholders involved in this process so that we can get constructive, continuous feedback when we design any such monitoring studies or when we implement any such legislation in Virginia. In public drinking water supplies, here is a map of Office of Drinking Water regional field offices. So we have 6 regional field offices, and you can see closest to you. And we implement, as Donald earlier mentioned, we implement Safe Drinking Water Act in more than 2,800 public water systems. And on PFAS occurrence studies, also our regional field offices are helping us in collecting that data. So far, what we have done in this regard, our first priority was to understand the occurrence of these chemicals in our drinking water or in our public drinking water supply. So we initiated a phase 1 PFAS occurrence study back in summer of 2021. And at that time, this was driven by House Bill 586 from 2020. That bill asked us to sample no more than 50 water systems, public water systems. So we planned to collect 72 samples from 50 locations, but eventually, because of certain considerations, we were able to collect 63 samples from 45 water systems. And we have over 2,800 water systems in Virginia, just to put things in perspective. Out of these 45 systems, 40 were surface water systems, 5 were groundwater systems. The way we designed this study was that we prioritized these 45 water systems based on their proximity to potential PFAS contamination site. We got a mix of groundwater systems, surface water systems, and we also took some source water samples from where our treatment plants, they were pulling that water. And collectively, these 45 systems, they served more than 4.5 million Virginians. And we used EPA method 533 to analyze 25 chemicals in this study. And we reported any concentrations above 3.5 parts per trillion. We have a web page, VDHODW PFAS web page. All these reports and study results and other PFAS related information is available online as well on our web page. The links are provided on this slide. To give a glimpse of what we found in that phase 1 small study, here are the results. So essentially, the bigger the circle, the higher the concentration of PFAS, and the individual pies within that circle represent individual PFAS chemicals. So you can see that there are some areas that are concentrated on Northern Virginia side of where we saw some higher frequency of detections. And again, these detections doesn't mention that they were above lifetime health advisory at that level, which was 70 parts per trillion. These were just detections of at least one PFAS chemical at that time. As that phase 1 study, we just sampled 45 systems. We got feedback from our stakeholders, from our work group, and there was a need of collecting additional information, additional PFAS occurrence data on this effort. So we initiated a phase 2 sampling effort, PFAS sampling effort back in summer of 2022. Right now, as we speak, this is in progress. We're utilizing an external lab for this analysis, and samples go through appropriate QA/QC process before we release those to the water systems. And once Waterworks review that, and then we plan to collect all those verified results, and we will release the results once this study is over. And our focus is on collecting most of these samples from small and medium systems, as EPA is conducting their own sampling under UCMR 5 on all the larger systems. Okay, so here is a comparison of phase 1, phase 2. As I earlier mentioned, we are collecting a lot more samples in this effort than in our phase 1 effort. And the focus of this phase 2 is to collect samples only after treatment, whereas in phase 1 we also collected some source waters. I have provided some hyperlinks to the reports that were published in last couple of years from this work on this page. And on the Virginia PFAS phase 2 sampling event, so far we have collected 76 samples, and we have seen some detections, and there is one particular water system where we saw GenX detection at 52 parts per trillion, and we are working with them on mitigating and reducing the level of that chemical at their facility. And again, we have recommended, out of the 76, we have recommended resampling at 12 locations because they didn't pass through our QA/QC procedures. And we hope to complete this investigation by the end of July of this year. So what are we recommending to Virginia Public Water Systems? As at this time, there are no current federal regulation or MCLs for these chemicals at this time, although there are some federal actions that we'll be talking about in the next section. At this time, these chemicals are not regulated at state or federal level. So what we are recommending to our system, public water system, is that if they are concerned about the PFAS contamination, they should sample for such chemicals, and if they detect such chemicals, then the first task that they need to do is to notify their customers so that they are aware of the potential risks involved, and they can take appropriate mitigation measures. And then look for ways to reduce that exposure, and there we are recommending multiple things to reduce that impact. They can use an alternative water source, they can blend water, they can install a treatment, and things of that nature. And what we are recommending is that we have resources here at Office of Drinking Water. If they need any technical or financial information, we will be happy to talk to them and provide that guidance and assistance. And this part was more on the public water system side of things, and we have millions of private drinking water wells in Virginia. And for that part, I would like to call one of our colleagues from Office of Environmental Health Services, Anthony. And we'll take questions in the chat or after completing the private well water section. Thank you.
Tony. Yes, I'm Anthony Creech with the Office of Environmental Health Services. And, I suspect that at this point, it's clear to everyone that this is a pretty complicated subject. Chemistry, waterworks engineering, acronyms that are impossible to pronounce. They all begin with P and there's thousands of them. But we're, the audience of this group is, health department, BEQ, personnel primarily who are familiar with a lot of these basics. Imagine the owner of a private well. Some of them are chemists, some of them might be waterworks engineers, but most of them aren't. And, the thing about private wells, and this is, apologies to those for whom this is old news, but our authority at Virginia Department of Health extends to the location and construction of private wells. We want to make sure they're put in a place where they're protected from contamination sources and that they're constructed properly. And the only water quality analysis that is regulated by BDH is the bacteriological sample that just confirms that the well was constructed properly. At that point on, everything with the well, its maintenance, water quality sampling, everything is the responsibility, discretion of the well owner. We don't have authority to require people to test their own wells. We can't make a third party test their own wells. We do not have funding or authority to test wells ourselves. And not just about PFAS, but like any contaminant, lead, nitrate, whatever. It's always been that way. So what we serve as primarily for well owners is an educational resource. We have the guidance out there, what you should test for, the frequency at which you should test, so on, how you understand those results. That's what we do. But beyond that, we can't make anyone do anything. It's all advisory. How do
I got it. Now.
Tony saying does not get the only technical problems. We share. Yes.
You should be good now, I think.
All right. So we have a resource for well owners, and this is on our external webpage, PFAS and private wells. And this is specifically for lay people. And I'm just going to quickly go in it. PFAS and private well water, and it's pretty much set up as an FAQ page. If you went through and read the whole thing, it might take 10 to 15 minutes. If you went through and read every link that it sent you to, you could spend a few hours here, but it's essentially set up to address the questions that well owners will ask, including questions about testing and about what do I do if it's in my water. And we've also tried to address the kind of questions that we, as the professionals in the field don't necessarily deal with, but it's going to be a mystery to a well owner. They get their well tested and they know there's, these certain 6 PFAS substances that they have numbers to compare to, but they're going to get a lab sheet with 25 or more results on it. And like, what are all these other PB and blah, 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 blah. So, we've got guidance in here to help them understand, in that case, the research is ongoing. Hold on to your certificate of analysis. Don't throw it away, because the number, whether you detected something or not, might be useful in the future, answering those kinds of questions. So I really recommend this. Yeah. If you are watching this and you have a private well, please go to this page and kind of familiarize yourself with it. There we go. Thank you. If you work for a local health department and you deal with people who have questions about their wells, become familiar with this. You can refer citizens to this, it's for them, and get the answers to the questions. So of all the stuff I say today, knowing about this webpage is the most important thing. So having said that, just kind of want to go through some basics pertaining to private wells. Do we recommend that people get their wells tested? And the answer is yes, yes, we do. For the same reason that we advocate they test their well, annually for bacteria and nitrates, on a certain basis, different schedules for metals, at least once for radionuclides. We recommend people understand what's in their water. But with the case of PFAS, it's especially if they're in an area where there's a known source of PFAS or other water supplies where PFAS have been detected. And, we've seen enough about where we think these places are, manufacturing sites, airfields where firefighting foams were used, so on. The DEQ PFAS dashboard that Jeff Steers presented is an excellent resource that people can go to find out if they're in an area of concern. Actually, let me just go back and touch on one quick thing. You see, it says, especially when a private well is located near a known source. What does near mean? That's going to be site specific. I mean, geology is different in different parts of the state. There's different well depths, how serious the concentrations of the release are in the area that they're at. They're all interrelated, whether you're uphill or downhill. I mean, these are all local factors. So the near is sort of a risk evaluation that has to happen on a case-by-case basis. So as far as getting their wells tested, there are commercial laboratories. Tony mentioned, and I think Jeff mentioned, DCLS gearing up. DCLS is not a source for private citizens. They're not allowed to compete with the private sector. So it's commercial laboratories. A lot of you are familiar with the Virginia Household Water Quality Program, which is operated out of Virginia Tech, the Extension Service, and they're a wonderful resource for well owners in the state. They do workshops all over the state every year where people can come in, learn about their wells, get a sample kit, have their wells tested for the standard suite of contaminants, lead and nitrate and so forth, at a very, very reasonable cost. But currently they are not testing for PFAS. Currently they are not gearing up to think about testing for PFAS. That could certainly change, and if it does, we will shout that from the rooftops. But for right now, unfortunately, they're an educational resource, but they don't do PFAS testing. It has to be a commercial laboratory. Tests aren't cheap, a couple $100, maybe $300 for one sample, and that's a lot of money for some people, and it may be the difference between feeding yourself for other people and doing this test. So there are financial aid organizations that are out there for those circumstances. The EPA methods, the drinking water methods that have already been mentioned are the appropriate ones. How to find a laboratory. DCLS has a website showing all the accredited and certified labs in Virginia by method. It's not the most user-friendly website. It's really, you have to really know what you're searching for to get there. So, we recommend people go to EPA's UCMR5 approved lab list. Number one, these are labs accredited to do these tests, so you know that right off the bat. They're not necessarily limited in Virginia. There's no reason if someone can get a turnaround from a lab in Chicago quicker than they can from a lab in Virginia, they could use the lab in Chicago. You heard a lot already about the sample collection procedures, what to do and not do when collecting a sample. A lot of times homeowners think they can just wash out a peanut butter jar and take a sample from their kitchen sink and take it to a lab. that's not going to, that doesn't work for the normal, the traditional tests that we'd look for in private wells. It certainly won't work for
Can y'all
PFAS.
hear me?
Yes. Okay. Um,
Sorry, is that better?
That's good. Yeah, that's fine.
Ken and Kevin, do y'all care if I invite one of
okay, we've got a little external communication there. Typically, the labs will provide both the sample bottles and detailed instructions for collecting the samples, but in case they don't, we have a link for homeowner, well owners to use to sample their, collect the samples for their wells, and that's available on the web page that I referenced. Next question is what to do with the results. And the first part of that is it's non-detect. There's no PFAS in my well. I'm great. Do we recommend additional testing? Right now we don't. We don't say, well, test every year or anything like that. We don't have any basis to do that, to make any recommendation of that nature. But, there are a lot of people who may have already tested their wells and their results for PFOA and PFOS, which were probably what they were testing for at the time, were below the 70 part per trillion health advisory that was being used as guidance when they collected their sample. And now the proposed MCL is 4. And if they're in between those two numbers, they may want to rethink it, or they might just decide to treat based on their previous result. But, there's always that. If there's a new release in the vicinity, especially if they're downstream or downhill, and again, there's no specified distance on that, that's a site-specific determination. They can consider getting their well tested again. And if there's an advisory comes from any federal or state agency saying, we recommend private well owners in this geographic area test their wells, then that would be obviously a factor as well. But in general, if they're non-detect, they're one and done, at least until we, have a better knowledge base to move from. So understanding the results, as I mentioned before, they're going to get a sheet from a lab with dozens of PFAS chemical numbers on them, and the quote unquote bad ones, Tony mentioned 9, EPA has proposed 6 for drinking water MCLs. Those other ones, as I mentioned earlier, hey, hold on to that. Those are chemicals that are being researched. And just because they're PFAS doesn't necessarily mean they're bad. Think of it compared to metals. Some metals are toxic at certain concentrations. Other metals at that same concentration are not toxic at all. They may be orders of magnitude different, or they might never show up on a toxicity thing. So just, recognize that you have this data, hold on to your certificate of analysis. Now, the proposed MCLs, they apply to public water supplies, and MCLs have never been enforced or regulated for private wells, but they, as a rule of thumb, have usually been the basis of comparison. Someone gets a result for something in their well, they want to get understand, is it good or bad? They compare it to the MCL that applies to a public drinking water supply. Currently, they have PFOS. PFOA has 4 part per trillion. There's 4 other chemicals, and you'll hear a lot more about this later, but that's going to be especially confusing because you don't compare the numbers that you get from the lab. You have to plug those into a calculation, and then that gives you what's called a hazard index, and then if that number is what determines whether you exceed or don't exceed the MCL. That's going to be really confusing. I believe that labs will probably do the calculation for you and provide that on a certificate of analysis, but there's no guarantee that they will. So that page that I suggest you look at, PFAS and private wells, actually has, we built the calculator in that. So if nothing else, people can go and enter their 4 results there and get their hazard index. But again, these are the drinking water MCLs. CDC, their agency, the Toxic Substances, they have their own levels, and Dwight talked about these earlier. They're different. You can see here, these came out in 2021, and they've got PFAS, PFOS, two other PFAS chemicals at adult and child concentrations. Big difference between 78 for an adult, 21 for adult, and 4. But as Dwight mentioned, they're from different toxicology studies and other reasons. Why are we taking the risk of confusing well owners by giving them both sets of data? Well, number one, none of them are regulatory standards, so we want them to be educated. There is a difference between public water supplies and private wells, one of which is that public water supplies use a rolling annual average for their compliance for the most part. Dr. Singh will probably go into more detail later, but you know that they test continuously, sometimes daily, sometimes monthly, sometimes quarterly. They're in order to demonstrate compliance, and so if there's spikes or non-detects that are unexplained or this or that, it's put into a rolling annual average. Well, you sample a private well, you don't have that advantage at all. You're getting a snapshot, and that's, you know, unless you're Bill Gates, you're not going to be sampling your well, you know, on a regular basis. So there's a lot of reasons why there's these differences, and at least at present, until the knowledge about PFAS becomes more well defined, we are providing all this data so that the well owners can make their own decisions. It's a risk-based decision. We have a tool, an online tool, Be Well Informed Virginia. It includes PFOS and PFOA, and they are updated to the current proposed MCL. So it's a useful tool. People can enter their data. It tells them from their lab sheet and what the contaminants are, and they can determine, they get us above a level, below a level, what the health risks are, what the corrective procedures could be. Pretty happy that we have this tool. Now, they get a result, they show that they do contain PFAS. At some level, it could be above, you know, proposed MCL, below the risk management or the MR, you know, whatever the number is, it's a decision to, do I want to keep drinking this water or cooking with it? We are not advocating that they rely on bottled water, because FDA has not come up with what standards for bottled water should be with respect to PFAS. So they might be just drinking water that has PFAS anyway. The primary concern is drinking and cooking. There's less concern with dermal contact for showering and so forth. Boiling is completely ineffective for PFAS, so we want people to know that. There are basically there are home filtration systems that have been demonstrated to remove PFAS from water. Point of use means it's something at the sink or a refrigerator, ice machine, whatever. Point of entry is a whole house system. They are National Sanitation Foundation is the, you know, that's the seal of approval that you want them to look for. And, you know, that seal probably, at least at present, says that, you know, this feature, this device will remove PFAS to below 70, because that's when all the testing was done. It's going to take time for industry to catch up to the new levels, but they do work, and there's no reason homeowners wouldn't do them. The most important thing well owners need to know is these are not just install and forget devices. There's operation and maintenance, there's filter changes in order to make sure they still are treating the well water. And then we have a link on our website here for EPA's very detailed study into these kind of things. So that's a useful tool for the well owners. And in summary, We always encourage well owners to regularly test their water quality, private well owners. We add PFAS to those recommendations. MCLs are not enforceable, but they are what we have, at least now proposed. There's also the MRLs. It can be confusing. We acknowledge that, but we want to provide well owners with as much information as they need to make their own decisions. There are treatment systems that can reduce PFAS in well water. Got to take care of it. Most importantly, this is a very fluid living situation. New information, new tests, new studies from EPA are coming out all the time. We are committed to keeping that private well page up to date and the Be Well Informed tool. And as a demonstration of that, the day that EPA released their proposed MCLs, our web page was updated for that. So we're going to keep it current. And so with that,
We'll take maybe one or two questions we can pull up in this. And it is a lot of questions, by the way, so I don't think we'll be able to get to all of them, but here are, and I can scroll down to, can't get to all of them, sadly, but it's the last few here, if they pertain to you.
who's qualified to collect samples, special training, lab certified license. Right now, there's no official state license to collect water samples, but there are protocols that should be followed. So, a homeowner can collect their own water sample, but it's in their best interest to follow all of the suggested, guidelines for how to collect that sample to make sure they're eliminating cross-contamination and so forth. Plans or ideas for BDS, similar, same result FAQ page, what was done for the coalesce sites. Owners could enter their sample results for several constituents. Oh, question has just been answered. Hey. Elevated levels be required to be disclosed when selling a property if known due to testing. That's not a question for us to answer, but as I understand real estate law, if you know it, you're supposed to share it. But yeah.
Sure. So Anthony, this is Tony Singh here. And again, as of now, these chemicals are unregulated, and we don't have any such requirement for reporting these results when selling a property.
All right.
We're gonna, okay. We're gonna stop here as far as questions to allow for a 5-minute break. Your questions will be answered. We're addressing them in real time in our shared online Word document, and we'll also be sharing the answers later again. So it's now 10:03, and if you could be back at 8 minutes after 10, we would greatly appreciate it, and we'll get started with the last presentation. Thank you very much. Okay, it is 8 minutes after, and hopefully everyone had a chance to take your 5-minute break. And we're gonna go ahead and get started again. So lastly, we'll discuss the PFAS regulatory picture, including risk management, managing PFAS impacts in your community, communicating about the risks of PFAS, and a PFAS case study. Please put your questions and comments in chat, and please ensure that your microphone is muted. And I'll turn it over to Dr. Singh, Julie Henderson, Jeff Steers, and Brookie Crawford.
Thank you, Donald. This is Tony Singh again. So in this part of the presentation, or the first part of this second session, we'll be talking more about regulatory picture at state and federal level, or federal and state level. In Virginia, as far as drinking water is concerned, we have been following the federal guidance and federal guidelines. We have not established any of our state standards so far. So whenever EPA, when it comes to drinking water, EPA is the federal regulatory agency. So they come up with a regulation. We take that by reference, and that's how we implement it. On this slide, you can see different offices, and underneath that, what they are responsible for. Again, reminding everyone that if they have any questions on public water systems, private wells, milk, and landfills and source waters, what is the lead agency, so that they can contact them appropriately. Having said that, you can always reach out to the VDH team, even if it's a DEQ topic. We work very closely with DEQ, so we can also connect you to the right folks at DEQ. And some other federal agencies that are involved in regulating some of these chemicals in drinking water, FDA, Food and Drug Administration. They are responsible for regulating chemicals or regulating bottled water. Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, they work on the health and toxicology side of things. U.S. Geological Survey, they take a good care and good monitoring of our national rivers and national water resources. And eventually, U.S. Environmental Protection Agency is the lead agency on promulgating these regulations for contaminants in water, air, soil, and other environmental matrices. And since we are talking about PFAS and the regulatory status nationwide, I wanted to give a glimpse of where other states are on this topic. There are many states that are ahead of Virginia in regulating PFAS chemicals, so they have come up with their own uh, regulatory limits or advisory levels, health advisory levels, or action levels. And they have utilized different approaches. During our phase one study, we did look at other states, what approaches did they use to regulate or not regulate these chemicals, and what was good and what was bad, and things of that nature. So on this slide, I've shown that 10 or 11 states that have already established these state-specific legislations. Virginia is not one of that. We are still working on this topic on regulating these chemicals in Virginia drinking water. As I mentioned earlier, we follow EPA on regulating most of our chemicals when it comes to public drinking water supplies. And the EPA action timeline on regulating PFAS chemicals. So essentially in 2009, EPA is working on these chemicals from 80s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and all the way back. But in 2009, they came up with this provisional health advisory values for two of these chemicals, PFOA and PFOS. Those are the two most common detected and most toxic out of the studied chemicals so far. And in 2013 and 15, UCMR3, so it's a sampling event that EPA undertakes at a national level every 5 years. And under their uncontaminant monitoring rule 3, they conducted sampling nationwide. They looked for 6 PFAS chemicals in that UCMR3 sampling, and they detected PFAS occurrence in I think more than 1.3% of water systems. But at that time, their reporting level was very, very high. So that's why it was just 1.3% of our water systems nationwide. And then in 2016, after getting that data, and along with other scientific data available at that time, EPA revised their health advisories, and then they dropped or they lowered down the health advisory values. And then most of the actions on this topic started in 2021 with the PFAS strategic roadmap. So essentially, that's a document that EPA came up with outlining actions that EPA plans on taking not only for drinking water or water, but also on air, solids, and how to control these at the source. And just last month, EPA came up with a proposed first ever national primary drinking water standard for PFAS in public drinking water. And EPA plans to finalize this regulation for PFAS in drinking water in 2024, early next year. In the EPA strategic roadmap, they focus their attention on 3 key areas: research, restrict, and remediate. So essentially, as I mentioned earlier, there are thousands of these chemicals, and there are thousands that we don't know a whole lot about. So research and development work is needed on measuring those, assessing their toxicity and human health impacts and so forth. So EPA focused a lot on the research and development part dealing with these PFAS chemicals. And then restrict. So EPA came up with certain areas where they have mentioned that if we can restrict the release of these chemicals to the environment, because once these are released in the environment, they are hard to remove and they are expensive to treat. So they have outlined certain activities that they would like to undertake, or they are already undertaking in their strategic roadmap to restrict the use of or the release of these chemicals. And the third one is once these chemicals are released in the environment, what to do with them to remediate them so that we don't I mean, this doesn't impact public health. So under that also remediation part, it's not just drinking water. They're looking at a holistic approach in a holistic way that remediate the sources, remediate the traditional sources, the groundwater, the soil, the landfill, and other matrices. But their focus is on looking at the complete life cycle of PFAS from the manufacturing to the use to the release to the remediation part. And under this strategic roadmap, these are some of the highlights that EPA undertook just for water. And I have highlighted some of these that they have already accomplished in last 1.5 or 2 years. And one of the tasks that they have done is they have further lowered down their lifetime health advisory numbers. So essentially on this slide, you can see in 2009, they were at 400 and 200 parts per trillion. In 2016, they dropped the sum of these two, PFOA, PFOS, dropped to 70 parts per trillion. And in 2022, June of 2022, they reduced it to 0.004 and 0.02 parts per trillion. And that was, there were no methods available to detect those concentrations. And in 2022, they also came up with the final lifetime health advisory values for HFPODA, which is also known as the Gen X, and PFBS. During our presentation so far, you have heard lifetime health advisory, maximum contamination level goal, or MCLG, or maximum contamination level. So I wanted to make you aware of what's the difference between all these numbers. So health advisory is, EPA developed these health advisories to provide information on contaminant that can cause human health effects, and they're known to anticipate to occur in our drinking water. So essentially, it's to provide the technical information that be careful about these things. They are known, or they're potentially adverse to human health impacts. But these health advisories, they are guideline values, they are recommended values, they are not enforceable. MCLG, it's the maximum level of a contaminant in drinking water that a person can ingest over a lifetime without any known or anticipated adverse health effects. So essentially, if you keep consuming that amount over your lifetime, you will not have any impact. But again, this is a public health goal to make sure that public health is not adversely affected. And these numbers are also, MCLGs are also not enforceable. Whereas MCL, maximum contamination level, it's a legally enforceable primary standard that is enforceable. And right now, EPA came up with the proposed rule just last month to set up these MCLs that will be enforceable. And as I mentioned last month, EPA proposed these numbers for PFOA, PFOS, the MCLG, which is a goal, public health goal that is set at 0. So essentially, no exposure to PFOA, PFOS is good. And they have come up with the MCL numbers of 4 parts per trillion individual concentration. And EPA has also added the other 4 PFAS in this list of proposed MCL. That's PFBS, PFNA, Gen X, and PFHXS. But they did not come up with the individual MCLs for these chemicals. However, they come up with a hazard index approach. The hazard index approach says that, what will be the cumulative effect of all these 4 chemicals altogether. So essentially, it says that those 4 chemicals, they even if they are at a level less than their water acceptable concentration, then also if their cumulative effect can be additive and they can cause adverse health impacts. So they have come up with the hazard index of 1. If if the collective hazard index is greater than 1, then you exceed the MCL and you need to do something. And to calculate that hazard index calculation, here is the equation that they have used. So for each of those 4 chemicals, EPA came up with a health-based water concentration number. It's different for those 4 concentrations. So if you have to calculate this hazard index, then you need to find their individual concentrations and divide that by the individual health-based water concentration that is given here on this slide. And then if you add all those ratios, that will give you the hazard index. And if the combination of these 4 ratios is above 1.0, then water systems will be expected to reduce the level of these PFAS, otherwise they'll be in violation. I would like to mention that right now this is a proposal, so the rule is not effective at this time. And depending on the level of the contaminant found at the public water systems, the hazard index can exceed even if one, let's say Gen X is more than 10 parts per trillion, then also the total hazard index can exceed. And EPA is creating a web page to do these calculations where folks can just enter these individual detected concentrations, and the tool will calculate the hazard index value. So EPA published this proposed rule in the Federal Register on March 29th, and it's open at this time for public comments. The public comment period ends on May 30th. And Virginia plans to submit our comments through our national body, Association of Safe Drinking Water Administrators. And EPA plans to release the final rule by end of this year or early next year. And after that, Virginia will have 3 years to implement this rule. And once finalized, this rule will be applicable to only community water systems and non-transient, non-community water systems. This rule will not be applicable to transient, non-community systems at this time. And what this means for our water systems, if let's say your public water system exceed this MCL numbers in one of their sample, are they in violation? No. Because as per this regulation in its current proposed state, they all these community water systems and non-transient, non-community systems, they are required to collect 4 quarterly samples, essentially 1 sample every quarter, and then they'll take the running annual average of those 4 samples, and if that running annual average concentration exceeds the proposed MCLs or MCLs at that time, the water system will be in violation. There are some pros and cons of this approach, and as I mentioned earlier, EPA is accepting comments at this time, and there are comments that targets this approach as well. And again, what we are recommending to our public water systems at this time through various platforms is that if their running annual average exceed that number, notify their customers, reduce the exposure through any means, and look for ways to either treat your water or find an alternative water source or blend it or install treatment technologies. And then also look for the source so that you can mitigate the source, and that way the problem can be solved. And what is happening at the Commonwealth level? In 2020, General Assembly passed 2 legislations, House Bill 586 and House Bill 1257. Those 2 bills asked us to look into and regulating these chemicals. So in regard to those, we have performed multiple activities. We have submitted multiple reports on these 2 legislations. we formed a PFAS work group in October of 2020 that worked on this problem. We conducted studies and we presented our recommendations. In 2022, last year, General Assembly passed another House Bill 919 that asked us to keep working on regulating PFAS, but again, they asked us to perform certain other tasks, and if we want to regulate these chemicals, then it asked us to follow EPA's Safe Drinking Water Act process for regulating these chemicals. And at this time, since EPA is already ahead of us, they have already proposed this rule. Virginia is not looking at developing any of their own numbers or own rule at this time. So we are incorporating, or we are providing feedback to EPA on this issue and on regulating PFAS chemical, and we are waiting for EPA to finalize this rule so that we can adopt that rule. As I mentioned earlier, PFAS occurrence data is critical to understand the magnitude of the problem, to understand the needs of our stakeholders, to understand the public health impact. So we are trying our best to accumulate this data, gather this data from various sources. We are doing some of our own PFAS occurrence study. As I mentioned, phase 1 is already over. Phase 2 is currently in progress. And there may be a phase 3 if we feel that there's a need for additional testing. EPA, they conducted their UCMR3 sampling in 2013 to 2015, and right now EPA is conducting their UCMR5 sampling. They started this sampling in January of this year, and this will continue through 2025. So they'll be taking samples from larger systems and multiple other systems in Virginia. We are also looking at our partners, DEQ and DOD, if they have any data that we can collect from those sources. And we are also looking at literature if we can find any extra additional information on the PFAS occurrence as it relates to Virginia drinking water. And we have plans to do a more comprehensive investigation in next year or so on this, and we'll share that hopefully in next few months. But the overall strategy that we have at this time in managing these PFAS in Virginia drinking water is that, through our surveillance programs and other, but again, the three key theme areas are assessment. We are assessing the situation. We are assisting our stakeholders with the technical guidance, with financial means, and the awareness piece. Because this is a critical and very complex topic. We're talking about thousands of chemicals, and they are not equally toxic. They have different numbers for as far as health advisory values are concerned. There's a health advisory values, MCLGs, MCLs, and hazard index to further complicate it. So essentially all our efforts, they are focused on these three areas: assessment, assisting, and awareness. As earlier speaker and especially Anthony mentioned, this is an expensive affair. Testing, remediation, and creating this awareness, it takes lots of effort and financial resources. And last year, EPA, federal government passed this bipartisan infrastructure law. And in that BIL, there was an additional $10 billion that were allocated nationwide to deal with the emerging contaminants in nation's public drinking water supply. And we have a drinking water state revolving fund program at Office of Drinking Water that helps with the low interest loans to our water systems for water infrastructure projects. And through our DWSRF program, we will be allocating some of these funding. We are already doing that as I speak. There is a second program that Office of Drinking Water has that is on emerging contaminants in small and disadvantaged communities. So we have received some allocation under that program. We are creating a work plan for that, so that these two funding sources will be available through 2026. And the funding amount depends on the Congress appropriation for future years. But so far, under our DWSRF program, we are expected to receive about 12.2, 12.3 million every year for next 4 years. And under our small and disadvantaged communities grant program, we plan to receive 27.2 million this year, and then this is for 2 years of allocation, and for next 4 years this amount will be half of this number. And all this information was on the public water system side of things. And again, to talk more about the private well waters and things related to private well program, I would like to invite Julie Henderson, Director of Office of Environmental Health Services here. And again, we will be taking questions at the end of this session. In the meantime, you can keep adding your question to the chat. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Singh. It's really a robust program that Office of Drinking Water has for PFAS response. Okay, so Anthony went over a lot about private drinking water wells, so I'm going to really touch on it briefly and mainly just to kind of reiterate our responsibilities and limited responsibilities when it comes to PFAS and private drinking water wells here. So VDH regulates the location and construction of private wells, and Anthony's really already provided that this authority does not extend to the regulation of water quality beyond confirmation of, say, absence of bacteria as a condition for the approval of the well under construction. And our role at VDH really is an education and advisory role when it comes to private drinking water wells. So supplemental water quality and testing of approved private wells is entirely at the discretion of the owner, and Anthony talked a little bit about that. Some local governments in Virginia do have authority to expand on sampling requirements beyond our limited authority, but to this date, none of the localities have any standards for PFAS substances, whether it's testing or limits in private drinking water wells. Our involvement in PFAS has generally occurred where groundwater appears to have been polluted, say by use of firefighting foams, which you have learned already can contaminate groundwater and surface waters. So in these cases, we have provided recommendations for private water quality testing to private water well owners, and response actions associated with identified PFAS at released sites. Examples of these are the NASA flight facility, Wallops Island, the Naval Auxiliary Landing Field at Fentress and Chesapeake, the Chickahominy watershed in Henrico County. And the majority of these events to date, we know who the responsible party is. And so it's a part of an investigation where VDH has participated with DEQ in getting the responsible parties to respond to the event and work with us on development of the response activities. So we don't have an internal source of funding for private well testing or any water quality testing at this point. When it comes to private wells, or I'll get into more shellfish growing area sampling. We have used in these past instances that I mentioned, Virginia Environmental Emergency Response Fund funding, or VERF, and that's funding that DEQ receives, and it's specific to a specific event. So it's not ongoing funding, and it's something that we have to apply for a specific event. In those cases, we've coordinated with the United States Geological Survey, or USGS, to conduct the sampling related to the investigation for a subset of private wells. And we're also looking to coordinate with Division of Consolidated Laboratory Services, or DCLS. We conducted sampling to evaluate whether the PFAS substances previously detected in the private wells are also in the ground, so trying to find out if they're in the groundwater or a potential factor outside of associated with the well. It could be household plumbing. It could be, it was introduced into the home for the on-site sewage system following cleaning of PFAS, say for carpeting and upholstery. So there's, you know, some specific reasons why we would want to sample private wells during an investigation to determine the cause. So for foods and food packaging, PFAS are used in food packaging for many reasons. They provide resistance to grease, to oil, water, staining. FDA has authorized the use of very specific PFAS compounds in food contact applications. So this is something that FDA regulates. There are some resources available on the FDA site that speak to the use of PFAS in food packaging. They're also used in cookware and in food processing for, you know, things that we've already talked about. They have nonstick and water resistance properties. And so to ensure food contact substances are safe for use, FDA does look at what PFAS products are used in food packaging and has approved some packaging to this date. The concern here obviously is that the PFAS in packaging can transfer to the food, and FDA wants to ensure that that is very limited, and are, you know, they're currently looking to expand and have talked recently of late of looking at the restricting PFAS in food packaging, but right now it is currently allowed. There is some general advice that they provide to people to say, don't cook in that packaging. So don't cook in, you know, to-go containers, things like that. The containers that I'm showing here, oftentimes it's used in cardboard packaging. And so they advise for people to not cook in those. I don't believe it's labeled currently, and they don't require labeling for PFAS, so consumer would not know if PFAS is being used on the labels. I have seen where they'll say there's no PFAS is being used, but I don't think it's required for them to label it as such. So as the science for PFAS advances, FDA has stated that they'll work and intend to work with states and other federal agencies like EPA to identify and assess the safety of packaging, but also the safety of locally grown foods and foods that are produced in areas that have been identified as having PFAS contamination. And with states, this support usually means that we assist. And FDA could also assist us in testing and kind of in method development if we pursue having very specific regulations related to PFAS and food packaging. And they also can help with safety assessment consultations. And this has already occurred at the request of other states that have specific requirements for PFAS in food packaging. So typically, you know, we talk about environmental contamination with PFAS, and it's limited to, say, a specific geographic area. So, for example, foods that might be produced near an industrial facility, the use of soil, water, and biosolids contaminated with PFAS to grow crops or feed animals that are intended for food. That's how PFAS can get into foods, whether it be through raising fish or other seafood, and that can lead to PFAS entering the food supply. So we know it's well documented that PFAS is in the environment, but there remains much that we don't know about the likelihood of specific foods containing PFAS. FDA started testing PFAS in 2019, and only a few foods that they've tested, it's been very limited. So 10 out of 532 samples, they're mainly testing foods at retail at this point, have had detectable levels of PFAS. And, you know, they provided that this could be due to several factors. It could be lack of PFAS uptake in specific foods. It could be lack of PFAS found in the growing areas or manufacturing environment of of the food that they chose to sample were manufactured or grown. And it could also be limitations on the types of PFAS for which the labs can currently test for. So FDA has said that they will continue to sample, and when they find detectable levels of PFAS, that they'll notify the agency that has authority and work with us to help determine whether or not that product is at risk to the consumer and should be taken off the market. So broadly here in Virginia, Virginia Department of Agriculture, or VDACS, has the regulatory authority over food grown in Virginia. I'll go into specifically VDH and our authority for grade A milk and shellfish just in a second. So grade A milk. There's currently no defined action level for PFAS in grade A milk. For the grade A milk program at VDH has regulatory responsibility of grade A milk products. That includes milk, powdered milk, cream, yogurt, cottage cheese, and the program is administered through a cooperative agreement that we have with FDA through the administration of the Pasteurized Milk Ordinance, or the PMO. Grade A milk regulations are adopted and maintained, however, by the Virginia Department of Agriculture, or VDACS. But in recent years, the national dairy industry has seen a rise in concerns of PFAS, and specifically in Maine. They've had issues related to biosolid application and dairy farms. Sludges and treatment plant outputs we know are known sources of PFAS, and lands treated with PFAS contaminated biosolids could potentially have some concerns when it comes to dairy cows grazing on those lands. The EPA is conducting a health risk assessment of biosolid applications currently for both land application for impact to groundwater and uptake to crops. And we expect that EPA will publish that in 2024. So we know that PFAS can bioaccumulate in cows and lead to PFAS contamination in their milk. But there are currently no regulatory requirements for PFAS in milk, and FDA has advised us, however, though, if it's found to be present in milk, that product could not be sold, and that PFAS would be considered an adulterant and could potentially require sampling and testing to support, say, a health risk assessment by FDA. But of course, we would work with FDA to determine that. And if I've not heard that FDA is testing for milk at retail, but they would work with us if they started to and identified any cause for concern when it came to PFAS in milk for milk products produced and sold in Virginia. So bivalve molluscan shellfish. So Division of Shellfish Safety and Waterborne Hazards here in the Office of Environmental Health Services. They monitor shellfish growing areas in Virginia, and they classify shellfish waters for harvest and consumption. And that authority comes to us through the Virginia Code, and we follow standards that are set by the FDA in participation with the Interstate Shellfish Sanitation Conference, or the IFFC, and we follow what's called a model ordinance as it relates to water quality monitoring criteria, shellfish harvest areas, and the management of those requirements. The NSSP does establish that upon determination that there's toxic substances in the water or in the shellfish itself, that includes heavy metals, chlorinated hydrocarbons, and natural toxins that might be present. We do not currently sample for PFAS, and FDA does not have any requirements or standards as it relates to growing area classification with PFAS in shellfish growing areas. But the commissioner does have authority in the code to establish standards as it pertains to whether it's the examination of shellfish and examination of shellfish growing areas, any analysis of both the growing area and the shellfish, and inspection of both of shellfish. And this also extends to crustacea and finfish. So there are other specific seafoods that we also regulate and can classify and create standards for areas, growing areas of which we industry harvest. To this date, PFAS hasn't been linked to any public health significance in shellfish meats, but the FDA, as I mentioned, hasn't established any thresholds or regulatory guidelines for PFAS in shellfish or other seafoods. They have conducted some targeted surveys, and they did so starting in 2013. And they indicated, it was limited, but they indicated that out of 46 samples, they had 11 that had detectable levels, but none presented a human health hazard or human health concern, I should say. They also did another survey in 2022, and they surveyed 81 samples. These are all samples conducted at retail. And they identified 60 of those 81 that had detectable PFAS, understanding that these were also, these samples were focused on product that was produced and harvested outside of the United States. And it did end up in a recall of canned clams from China. And that's also published on FDA site. But we can expect them to continue to sample seafood at retail with a focus on shellfish. The Maryland Department of Health studied PFAS in surface water and oysters in 2020. That was a limited study, but they did not detect in any of the growing areas concentrations of PFAS, and they only reported detection of PFAS at one site. So in summary, VDH has very limited regulatory authority currently related to PFAS in foods, and VDH would take the lead in investigation of PFAS in retail food, grade A milk, shellfish, and some seafoods in Virginia. And we would work with, obviously, DEQ and Office of Drinking Water and any investigations where there was known contamination, especially in a grade A milk or grade A milk's being produced, or there's shellfish growing. Thank you.
Jeff.
Yep, so we're here from Jeff Steers. He's going to continue to talk about regulatory.
Okay, good morning again. Wanted to start a little bit kind of on the big picture, and this is multimedia. So, we have a great partnership with VDH, and work closely with Dr. Singh and Julie and the rest of the team on environmental health issues and drinking water. But to kind of give you a flavor for what's been going on nationally when it comes to PFAS, this is a sampling of some of the key things as part of EPA's roadmap for PFAS, and it hits every media of air, water, land, waste. So I'm not going to go through each of these in detail. However, I will say that this covers the gamut from product development. Right now, for example, there's low volume exemptions under the TSCA, the Toxic Substance Control Act, where certain compounds, depending on their percentage in the manufacturing process, aren't subject to necessarily the review or the pre-manufacture notices. So that they've looked at that with the low levels of PFAS that we're talking in a part per trillion. So a lot of the the end use importation chemical. I know we had a couple of questions about are there substitutes. So EPA is working with the manufacturing community on trying to encourage in the research and development of alternatives for some of these compounds. One of the other thing is You see on there, it says back in 2021, increased enforcement oversight via Tosca Clean Water Act. It's a little challenging to think that there's active enforcement in most cases when they haven't yet developed standards for whether it's the MCLs being finalized or water quality criteria under the Clean Water Act. However, EPA did recently take an enforcement action against Chemours in the West Virginia facility under the Clean Water Act. So there are things that they're doing on a national level. One of the other interesting aspects, for example, is that last thing on 2021 with total absorbable fluorine as a method for wastewater. That method, once they have a approved method, that is going to be something that may be helpful in screening for certain PFAS compounds without the cost associated with doing the scans for all of the 130 some compounds that you can get during an analysis. In going through, and you can just see as you go to the right on the screen, there's a lot of different things they've been working on. There's the research, the IRIS assessments, that's the Integrated Risk Information System, where they've actually are looking at the toxicity and doing the studies as they, there we go. As they develop standards and trying to look and understand how these chemicals, into Dr. Flamia's discussion earlier, the dose and the risk and the receptors and how those all work together. They've also been working on effluent limitation guidelines for certain categorical industries under the National Pretreatment Program. Just skip ahead and I guess to the next. It's the CERCLA hazardous substance designation cost recovery currently, and just for informational purposes, as these materials are not considered a hazardous substance under the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation Liability Act, or better known as Superfund, it's very difficult to have any legal authority require cleanup, let alone the standards for what is going to be considered a cleaned facility, whether it's in soils, groundwater, and all that research is going on. But EPA under the RCRA, that's the current Hazardous Waste Resource Conservation Recovery Act, and CERCLA, want to have the ability to cost recover where they have to come in and help clean something up. And what this does is it creates it as a hazardous material under CERCLA that, like any other substances, which they can then compel a facility to clean their areas up where this has been disposed of previously. Unfortunately, there's a lot of discussion in the legal community and the real estate community about the unintended consequences of doing that, where you may have sites where it's been land applied in biosolids or wastewater treatment plants that have received it. And, are they going to be considered liable, either joint or several liability under CERCLA for that hazardous substance designation? So there's a lot of unanswered questions about how that works going forward. So the other thing on it is at the bottom of that list, the Fish Consumption Advisory PFAS list, and that's something that Virginia is watching closely. I know BDH and DEQ, as they go along and develop aquatic life targets. And then the last year, 2024, just it's really trying to finalize a lot of what they've started in the short term here. I'll say that the biosolids risk assessment is something that's been watched very closely too, as it could potentially have a huge impact on the land disposal options for biosolids across the country. There aren't a lot of feasible alternatives. Landfills don't like to take biosolids for a variety of reasons. And, municipal incinerators would need to burn this material at a very high temperature. And considering the moisture content, it could be very expensive to try to do that. So there's going to be some very good, I suspect, debate and discussion on a national level. And I will say in Virginia, next one. There we go. Our role in DEQ is to provide support to VDH on their surveillance program, where they're collecting data. We were participating in the first study that was done at the 50 purveyors of water with their source water and finished water, which did lead to some information being discovered on some hotspots in Virginia that I'll go into later. Currently, there are no Virginia-specific regulatory requirements for reporting and controlling discharges of PFAS, nor are there any established surface water quality criteria. But we are looking for it. We have, as I mentioned earlier, we have a ambient monitoring water quality program that we've begun looking into. We're using our existing authorities. And this is something that we're currently not, I thought I had to say, we're currently not requiring self-monitoring on effluent or industrial municipal wastewaters. And I think part of this is being driven by the fact that we need to see what EPA does with not only this method 1633, but also on how that data would be used when it comes to establishing, once they establish water quality criteria. So there is sort of a pause, if you will, on that. And we're conducting investigations into sources where known releases of surface water or groundwater have occurred. Our goal obviously is to protect Virginia's air water resources, and we do this through ambient monitoring, source identification, assessing the risk both to air, land, and water, mostly through the water and soil media. And just again, because the air sources are so still undefined and the research is being done by EPA. And then our goal is to try to help control whether it's product substitutions or some type of best management practices at the source to reduce these getting into the environment through, for example, wastewater discharge. This is our long-term kind of prioritization. And you'll see that we did a survey of industrial facilities and utilities that was poorly responded to based on their SIC codes and some of the standard industrial classification codes, where we think PFAS is typically found. But we had a very poor response. So we're going to be working with our utilities and our permitted facilities to follow up and get answers to those surveys, so that we can identify areas where there may be discharges getting into Virginia's waters or groundwater. When we find hotspots or some, as we have documented, a facility that is directly impacting a public water intake and a public water supply, we are evaluating the need to require self-monitoring in those situations as well. And this just summarizes what I was just saying. And this is an example that EPA is working on with aquatic life criteria. We don't need to get into the details, but I wanted to show that there is work being done on acute, chronic, and instantaneous levels for the two most popular PFOA and PFAS. What they may look at. And we can compare some of these numbers with some of the fish tissue that we have found, with a couple of exceptions in the middle Chickahominy watershed. The numbers of the limited fish tissue testing we've done are not that significant thus far. Same with water quality and human criteria. We're looking, waiting for EPA to establish this. I know we'll work with VDH on looking at, as we develop water quality criteria for not only the public water supplies and human health, recreational, and fish consumption. And on a national level, EPA is trying to use its authority to require self-monitoring in certain industrial sectors. This gives you an example of some of the types of sectors that we're concerned with. They are going to start requiring self-monitoring in their states that they have the authority, the primary authority for doing NPDES permitting. Virginia is not one of them. And again, as I mentioned earlier, Virginia does not intend to require self-monitoring at this point as we wait to see what continues to go on a national level. But through our ambient program and the industrial surveys, we think we will continue to identify hotspots and then look at better narrowing in some type of monitoring program. Just something on firefighting foam, since they are a huge contributor to PFAS, PFOS. In January 2020, Virginia passed a law that requires that fire departments or other facilities not use, but it restricts or bans the discharge or use of PFAS containing aqueous film forming foam, which is AFFF, better known as, for testing or training unless the facility has implemented containment, treatment, disposal measures to prevent the release to the environment. So it's important to understand that while they may have banned training going forward using these materials, they've been used quite a bit over the years, and they are in the environment at fire training facilities, and as I mentioned earlier, at military bases. And so we have a lot of historic use that is going to need to be dealt with at some point going forward. And that's all I have.
Turn it over to Brookie.
And I'm going to turn it over to Brooke. The best part, which is how do we communicate this risk?
I'm Brookie Crawford, and I'm a regional PIO, which means that I often communicate on topics like this. I think we can all agree that this is a complex topic, that it's very technical with lots of acronyms and formulas, and that it's ever evolving. And so that makes communicating it unique. So we're going to talk a little bit about risk communication. Our goals are going to be to help people understand that technical acronyms, the formulas. It's going to be able to break it down and help them understand it. Remember that the layperson is not going to have a chemistry degree, and so we need to help them break it down. We want to build trust and credibility, especially since it's evolving. Things are going to be changing, and it's important that they trust us and come to us for information. And then we want to help shape their attitudes. So we want them to understand what PFAS is and not to panic, and how to approach the topic. And how we communicate can be a variety of things. It can be talking to the media. It could be working with our community partners for town halls, newsletters, even the little insert in the water bill. So there's a variety of ways we can do that. If you are going to talk to the media and you have not already taken our spokesperson training, I highly recommend that. We have one coming up on May 9th and another one on June 5th. Okay. As we already talked about, there are obstacles to communicating something like this. We've talked about the technicality and the ever-changing, but it's complex, it's uncertain. In general, people can distrust the government, science, because of their age, their youth. It could be for a variety of reasons. Conflicting evidence. Not everybody understands peer-reviewed research. Selective and biased in reporting, and I'll show you a little example of that later. Rumors and misinformation. We learned anything from COVID. We learned that misinformation can be an uphill battle for us. Emotion over logic. And with this comes fear, and fear can make people do some very illogical things. And then, of course, language barriers and cultural barriers. So the main part of crisis communication is to help tailor people's expectations and their perception of risk. Sometimes it's easy for scientists to look at it and see this is risk based on these numbers. General people don't always see it that way. It can be perceived differently. whether it's by type or size or important, their own factors in their life make a huge difference in that. And again, the technical versus the non-technical people will make a huge difference in how they perceive risk. When you're communicating about PFAS and other risk management, it's really important that you stay on topic on your message. And we will talk about how you get your key messages in just a little bit, but the point is that you can continually direct your message back to those key messages. You say it up front, you provide a little detail, some supporting evidence, and then you repeat it. And you repeat it again, and you repeat it again. Some tips are to acknowledge the uncertainty. PFAS has been around for a long time, but we're just learning about it. We don't even have the technology to test for every type. So acknowledge that it's evolving and that we will keep you, the people, informed as we learn. Provide protective actions, things that people can do. And you can't tell them about something that's scary and then not tell them how to protect themselves. So that's what they really want to know. You told me about this PFAS thing. What do I have to do to protect me and my family? And then provide them with here's what to do. Every message should end with a call to action, and that can be call a phone number, go to a website, talk to your water utility, whatever the message is. Make sure you have something for them to do so they feel active and feel in control. Here's an example of some bias in the news. There are some headlines regarding PFAS. You'll notice a lot of them talk about being forever chemicals. That is a term that the media has adopted, not one that we've pushed out. And that may be one we have to battle against. So it's very important that we have an understanding of what PFAS is and get that out so that the media can people can understand that and the media can use the correct terminology. When you want to talk about PFAS, you want to start by coming up with some talking points. What is the message that you want to get out? And importantly, what kind of questions are people going to ask? Before you start your talking points, just brainstorm. What things are they going to ask? What is PFAS? Where do you find them? How do I get exposed? Have I already been exposed? What does this mean for my health? So just sit down and brainstorm what kind of answers you're going to get. Even the hard questions are important to brainstorm about. Then you're going to develop your key messages. First of all, don't expect anyone to be able to read this in detail. This is just to give you a formatting idea. Donald has a hard copy of this and can email it out so that you can read it in detail. But this is what we call a message map. And this is how those of us in communications set up our messaging before we talk to the media. You want to have no more than 3 key messages. 3 is a magic number. It's what people can remember. And you can set it up in multiple ways. You'll see that there are 3 columns, and at the top is the key message for each one, and below it are some supporting evidence. Your messages can be what happened, what's happening now, and what the future looks like. Or in this case, it's what is PFAS, what's being done about it right now, and what's that mean for your health. So how you set it up is entirely up to you. This is an internal document for you to prepare before speaking to the press or the community. It's not a document that gets sent out. So here, the nice complete sentences, my own personal message maps tend to be bullet points. That's a preference. But the idea is that you lay out your key messages and some supporting evidence. And then when you talk about it, you can mention your key message, repeat it, or give some supporting evidence, and then repeat your key message again. Here are some general drinking water messages. The Office of Drinking Water is working closely with water utilities to provide information. Health advisories are just that, they're advisories, they're not enforceable. And the EPA is making final decisions on it and some information about the regulation as well. Some people are obviously going to be concerned about their health, and they're going to want to know, what does this mean for them? PFAS are present in the environment, air, water, and many consumer products. Many industries are starting to phase this out, but we're still trying to assess how much exposure people have and what they can do to reduce their exposure. A person's not able to see, smell, or taste PFAS in drinking water. The only way to know if it's there is to do sampling. And so you might talk to your water utility about sampling, and I believe we've already talked about several other ways to do that. What does that mean to a person's health? It can mean a variety of things depending on the type of exposure and your own personal health history. So if you're older or younger, or if you have pre-existing conditions, things like that will have a different factor for each person on how it'll be affected. Here's some communication resources. So places you can go to find out some information about PFAS before you talk to anybody else about it. And lastly, don't go it alone. It's a complex topic. It's a complex topic. Don't try and wing it. If you have any doubts, please talk to these experts before talking to the press or the community, and make sure that we've got the most up-to-date information. I think that's it.
Yes, Jeff's coming back up.
Okay, and here's Jeff again.
All right, we're in the home stretch. And I'd like to wrap it up with just talking a little bit about a couple of investigations that we've got going on in the Commonwealth right now, which were found primarily by water utilities that were monitoring or taking the initiative even before the VDH study to look for it. And we have three primary ones that you can just think of, they're identified in the map there: the Occoquan watershed in Northern Virginia, the Middle Chickahominy in the Piedmont, and the Upper Roanoke River just upstream of Roanoke. And I wanted to touch on a couple of these. The Occoquan watershed, through sampling being done by a collaborative effort with the Occoquan Lab, Virginia Tech's Occoquan Lab, and its partners at UOSA and Fairfax Water, have done quite a bit of sampling and have discovered some significant amounts in some surface waters for various PFAS compounds. And those compounds are both associated with firefighting foams, but also with industrial sources. So it's a little challenging because the contribution from potentially airports and the use of it in fire training at other facilities, coupled with it being used in some potential, and I won't identify the sources, but we feel like there may be some sources we know that are contributing to this. And so that's an ongoing investigation that we're helping and assisting with, primarily being led by those utilities in that northern area planning district. The other one is the middle, and I'll get to that actually. I have to go back to the Upper Roanoke River watershed. That was one where through the VDH study, they identified Genex, a compound from the Genex process that was developed by DuPont, was actually impacting the Western Virginia Water Authority's reservoir, and they started to do some testing of the Roanoke River, where they pump out of, and found some elevated levels in the river, which led to a discussion and collaboration with DEQ, VDH, and the Water Authority to try to find the source. And considering there aren't a lot of potential sources upstream in that rural area, we did in fact find a wastewater treatment plant that was receiving wastewater from an industrial user that was actually taking in filters and ion exchange filters and other equipment from treating PFAS or Genex contaminated materials, that media, and they were cleaning them at this site, and that Genex was getting out into the environment through their discharge into the public municipal wastewater treatment plant and into the Roanoke River, and ultimately into the Western Virginia Water Authority's reservoir and their finished water. So the authority has stopped pumping out of the river. They have been treating their water for and successfully can remove the PFAS compounds to below the 10 part per trillion that was originally identified as a health hazard advisory. And they also working with the authority and the wastewater treatment authority in Montgomery County and the source, we were able to stop the receipt of, or the company that was responsible to stop receiving these filters has begun cleaning out their process tanks and vessels. And we've seen a substantial reduction of Gen X compounds in their wastewater, as well as the effluent going into the watershed from getting into the North Fork of the upper Roanoke River. I think it was the South Fork, actually, of the watershed. And the numbers are going down, but they're not where they need to be, but it's an ongoing effort to work collaboratively with all the parties. The last study that we're working on is the Middle Chickahominy watershed. And this is one where we began this process after learning from the Newport News Water Works that they had been doing quite a bit of a study of PFAS compounds after they, through some routine monitoring, found it in their in one of their reservoirs being pumped from the Chickahominy River. And so they did quite a bit of sampling upstream and into some tributaries and into the White Oak Swamp, which kind of is if it's sort of the buffer between the Richmond International Airport and the river and the Chickahominy River. And they found some very significant orders of magnitude above the standard that EPA proposed for MCLs and the lifetime health advisories in surface water. And so we've been working, and we set up a collaborative process to coordinate our response using a unified command structure where DEQ, BDH, and Henrico County work together on sampling plans of local water bodies in and around the airport, sampling of private and public water wells, sampling of sediment and fish tissue, development of a communications plan, and working on identifying potential responsible parties, because not only is the airport there, but there's a former Air Guard base and an active Army Guard base that would have done training, probably using the AFFF phone. So this unified command structure allows us to not only share information, but review plans for going and approving plans in a collaborative way, so that we're all on the same page and we can work together in being responsive to the public. So we actually have calls every other week on this, and we also created a similar one for the Roanoke investigation. So, oops, backward, forwards. So we created a storybook map on our webpage that we share, that we worked on with BDH and Henrico County to describe this study, what PFAS is, what we found in the watershed, some of the history and documents. We did an initial press release, and this goes back a couple of years now, and some informative webinar and in-person meetings with the public. We also created a dashboard of all of our monitoring data. This includes data collected by Newport News, Henrico County, BDH. So you can go through and look at all the data from sediment water column sampling, private well sampling, although the locations aren't specifically identified due to privacy concerns. And then we compare them to, at the time, what the standard was, and you can get a sense of the situation. So DEQ is currently working on trying to work with the military and Richmond International Airport to further characterize groundwater and surface water. There's thought to be a pretty significant plume in groundwater that is getting into the surface water and into the water column. And so more study is got to be done to determine the rate and extent of that. So it's a long-term process, and it's hard for the public to understand. I know BDH has been working in the Health District and Henrico County on some treatment systems that were put on point of entry. That was it. Point of entry systems for treating these compounds in private homes. So it's a long-term process until we can continue to work to get this addressed. So I encourage it. This actually is highlighted on our homepage on our DEQ's website currently, so you can get a flavor and kind of go through. And I think it's a great communication tool that is helpful for the public to get in a little better context and easy to understand language what we're dealing with when it comes to PFAS. And that's all I have. I think we're ready for questions.
Yeah, well, hold on, you stay right there, you may be able to answer. Did you see that? That was Katie.
I think that's probably.
This is Dwight. So there's a question that reads, given the time it may take long to develop health effects, has there been any talk of state or federal level about health registry? I don't know the complete answer to that question, but it was something that I'll look into and we can post on the webpage. I do know that the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, which is essentially the toxicologists at CDC, have been collecting, to some extent, a health registry around where there are sites where there gross contamination of PFAS, particularly around airports.
Scroll through any.
I think most of them we verbally or got written response to, but not all.
So we have several questions and we have responses. They're in this document here that we're sharing on the screen. And you should be able to see some of the responses. And I'll put this on our webpage as well.
There is one question, is there any burden to mitigate these compounds being placed on the manufacturers that use or sell products that contain them? So what we're talking about there is product liability. And as we saw with PCBs, there's been class action suits brought by states and by individuals to hold companies that have created these impacts into the environment and human health to be held responsible for payment into managing them. And so, you know, that's not uncommon either in the PFAS world. They do have quite a bit of knowledge. I'll take for example, 3M and DuPont have a lot of technical knowledge that can be helpful on product substitution, on being able to look at best ways to treat these materials. They're probably the experts more than anyone because they develop the technology. And so I know some states are working with them on getting that information more available to the public and to those areas that impacts have had.
And there was a question on the sampling part, and Anthony answered that question. But again, I wanted to add that if anyone from our audience, from our local health districts or drinking water DEQ, if they are interested in volunteering to be the samplers, there may be opportunities in near future on training, creating trainings on that topic. So email any of your contacts at your local agency, local office, and we'll keep you posted on when we schedule those trainings.
All right, with that, I think we're gonna wrap up here. We're at about 11:24, and we appreciate everyone's participation today. Again, these questions and answers that we've collected, we'll make them available along with the PowerPoint presentation and the PFAS message map template. We'll make sure everyone gets that. And thank you for your participation and hope you have a great weekend. And again, thank you.